4. Good afternoon and welcome to Wednesdays at 1 and the second half of the book of Esther. We're going to start on chapter 4. We got 1 through 3 done last week. So if you are hearing me and you're here listening, I'd really appreciate it if you would just say something on the scroll on the feed so I know who's here. Appreciate it if you would do that. And turn to Esther, the 4th chapter. If you're in the Lutheran Study Bible, it should be page 779, or if you have other Bibles, you're on your own for the page number. Sorry about that. Hope you are pod afternoon, Phil. Oh, I bet you mean good afternoon, huh? This is kind of a podcast, so it's a pod afternoon. Okay, I had a couple of things I wanted to remind you of before we get started today, and then I wanted to answer the 2 questions that came up that I was going to look at the Greek version, excuse me, the Greek version of Esther as opposed to the Hebrew version. And if you were with me last week, you will be aware of the fact that Esther, as all of the Old Testament documents that we have, was written in Hebrew originally. And then another manuscript was done, another translation was done from the Hebrew into Latin, and then from Latin into Greek. So we have those original manuscripts of all 3 versions. But if you have an apocrypha in your Bible, you also have the Greek translation. And some of it is a little bit different and could be because of what was going on with the Greeks taking over the world at that point. But so I wanted to refer to the Greek version of Esther to see if we could get a little more information about those questions that came up. Not to say that they aren't, that just because they're not exactly the same in content and that sort of thing, that they're not part of the Bible, which is one of the reasons why the Apocrypha exists, to allow for us to listen and to look at other original manuscripts from other languages that may give us some more information about what we're studying. So I wanted to remind you that one of the things about the importance here of what's going on is that we're talking about the 2 main characters being Esther and her cousin Mordecai, who had raised her when her parents died. And then we've been going along where she kind of wins the beauty contest and becomes the king's wife. And so she is now living in the royal palace. Her cousin Mordecai is around, but is not working in and around the palace. He's in the story. But then just what we saw last week in chapter 3, all of a sudden the king appoints Haman kind of as his right-hand man. And one of the questions was, why Haman? Because he's a nasty person and not a good guy. But it's one of the things, remember, we talked about last week, is that this is a court tale. So you have good guys and bad guys that really aren't important as far as the depth of the character development, but what the character moves forward in the story. So the characters really are there to move the plot forward in this kind of storytelling. And that's exactly who Haman is. He's the bad guy who's going to move the story forward. And so we don't have a lot of background. We don't know why the king chose him. And I looked in the Greek texts, and there's no indication that they had any previous relationship, the king and Haman, or that he had proven himself to the king in any way, shape, or form. He was just chosen to fill that slot of being sort of the assistant to the king, sort of thing. So that's what we know about that. Um, Keep in mind, though, and when we start talking about this interaction between Haman and his vitriol against the Jews, and especially when he finds out that the queen is Jewish, and this moves on. But here's a little bit of background. Um, um, an audience after the exile would hear in these ethnographic modifiers not only a difference in racial and ethnic background, but also a history of antagonism. Haman is an Amalekite, but he is referred to as an Agagite in our text. Agag, Ag, is the name of the Amalekite king whose life was spared by King Saul in a story in 1 Samuel 15. Saul's decision was made in defiance of God's direct command to destroy all of the Amalekites because of their mistreatment of Israel. Part of their mistreatment was when the Israelites were moving towards the promised land, they got between them and the promised land and were starting to argue with them, fight with them, and just in general, had something against the Jews. So they have that history of this antagonism between the Amalekites and Jews. So because Haman was an Amalekite, but Agag, the king at that time, um, who was killed by Saul, or basically spared by Saul. I'm sorry. Saul did not kill the king against God's wishes. So the prophet Samuel had to kill Agag, and the reference to Haman as an Agagite signals the reader to recall Saul's failure to successfully execute the ban on the nation of Amalek. Okay, so you've got this animosity going on between Amalekites and Jews, and this is where it began. Okay, so that Mordecai and Haman are not going to get along, and when Esther reveals herself as Jewish and stands up for the Jewish people, the rest of the story now that we're going to talk about today is her working the system to protect the people of Israel. So that's kind of what the second half of this is all about. The other question that we had was why when Mordecai went to the gate of the town and was kind of hanging out there and found out that Haman was going to be chosen to take on this role, um, there was all this all of this fervor about why, by the eunuchs, the people who were the workers in the royal court, and it just kind of seemed to come out of nowhere. Like, what's the big problem? Why are they so upset about this? So let me read you. Now, this is from the Greek text of Esther. It's called Esther with additions. Um, but here, Mordecai is attached to the royal court in some way, serving somehow, which is not doesn't come out in the Hebrew text. So let me just read this from the Greek text. Meanwhile, Mordecai was serving in the courtyard. Esther had not disclosed her country, such were the instructions of Mordecai, but she was to fear God and keep his laws just as she had done when she was with Mordecai. So Esther did not change her mode of life. Now the king's eunuchs, who were chief bodyguards, were angry because of Mordecai's advancement, and they plotted to kill King Artaxerxes. That would be another name for the guy we've been talking about. Ahasuerus is the way it's named in Hebrew. So the matter became known to Mordecai, and he warned Esther, who in turn revealed the plot to the king. He investigated the two eunuchs and hanged them. Then the king ordered a memorandum to be deposited in the royal library in praise of the goodwill shown by Mordecai. So in this place, what happened was Mordecai overheard the eunuchs talking and about that they were going to kill the king, and And they didn't like Mordecai in the first place because he had been advanced, whether they knew he was Jewish or not. They just didn't like him, and because of that, and when Mordecai finds out that they're plotting to kill the king, he tells Esther, and Esther warns the king, and so then these two eunuchs then are killed. And again, in the Greek text, it's translated hanged, but we talked about it before that it was obviously, it could have been that they were placed on a spike, and that's kind of the precursor for crucifixion. So we talked about that last week. So those are the questions that we had, and I thought it was kind of interesting to actually find a little bit of a direction by reading the text in the Greek translation. So that was my homework. So now you have the result of my homework, and we can go on and read for today. We're going to begin in chapter 4, but let's start with a prayer. Gracious God, once again, we come before you to study your word, to hear the stories that have become such a big part of all of our lives as we try to express a faith in a God who works in such mysterious and amazing and wonderful ways. We thank you for the story of Esther and all of the things that it might teach us. We ask that you would open our eyes and our hearts to see things that we may not have seen before. We ask all of this in the name of the one who brought us the word and who is the word, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to start reading in chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went through the city wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and to entreat for her people. Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message from Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come in to the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do, and after that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Okay, so I'm seeing here, Pam says, did anyone else's feed stop? Okay, everybody, yours okay?
Yeah.
Everybody is still with me? Okay, so I wanted to bring out a couple of themes here that start to develop now in this fourth chapter. One of the things that Mordecai had been very clear with Esther about was that she should not reveal um, um, that I just got caught. My eye got caught. Pam says it's back after I refreshed. I'm so glad you're refreshing now, Pam, that we can carry on. Um, no, that Mordecai had told Esther not to reveal that she was a Jew, and yet you kind of wonder how she had lived in the household unless she had just completely covered up and let go of all the Jewish ritual and the guidelines for food and that sort of thing. Just kind of wondering, what she had to do to um, feel like she was still being honorable to God by being Jewish and all the Jewish trappings of what they did at that time, or if she was doing them secretly. And there's a couple of clues in here. First of all, obviously Mordecai doesn't have a problem with it because he and all the Jews who are just completely disheartened by the king's ruling that all the Jews will be killed, wherever this is happening, the Jews are mourning in the way that we are used to hearing about people mourning in Jesus' time, that they would tear their clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and then go through the city wailing with a loud and bitter cry. This is a mourning kind of activity. The rituals of mourning, where you wear sackcloth and ashes, and keen, where the women would keen, that really high pitched um, sound of lament and mourning, that the mourners would come and be outside of the tomb and mourn in a loud voice for those who had lost loved ones. So he's in sackcloth, but obviously you can't enter into the king's area in sackcloth because that's not appropriate. Um, and so she sends garments out to him and says, basically, here's something, get out of the sackcloth, and he won't do it. So she enlists Hathach, one of her eunuchs, to go and try to talk to him and to get him to cover himself up, because he's basically revealing himself to be a Jew, and it wouldn't be safe even if he felt like he was protected. Walking around in sackcloth would certainly let people know what was going on. But it interests me here, one of these themes that is, we usually hear the echoes of the Old Testament from the New Testament, but now we're seeing some of the origins of things that will become an echo for us when we read in the Gospels some certain stories. What does this make you think of now? Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city, and Mordecai told him all that had happened and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Okay, so there's a payment here for the death of a Jew or Jews, okay, and a written copy of the decree issued for the destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king. This is kind of some of the echoes of what's going to happen with Judas, that he's going to be paid to betray um, his colleague, his rabbi. So there's this betrayal that goes along. There's money, it changes hands, so that those who are not willing to actually do the deed are paying for someone else to take care of that for them. So then Esther and Mordecai have a conversation, and Mordecai says, now's the time, basically. You need to go in and talk to the king about this and see if you can't do something about it. And she reminds him that if you go in to see the king in his inner chambers without him asking, you die. I mean, it's a sentence of death, unless he holds out the golden scepter and basically gives you a pass for doing that. And so she says, I don't want to do that because it's not it's not allowed. I can't. He hasn't called me for the last 30 days and probably won't be calling me again. And so she says, I don't want to do that. And, Mordecai basically says, look, you're not going to escape being Jewish just because you're here in the palace. So, this is a time when you need to step up for what you believe in, or your family will perish, your people will perish. And so it's interesting here that then she says, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. Again, these ritual kinds of ways of dealing with grief and that sort of thing. And my maids will also fast, and I and my maids will also fast as you do. So there are certain rituals, activities that she continues to do, and obviously has her maids going along with her. So maybe she has been doing some of the Jewish rituals and things that are required in her own chambers and with her own staff. So and she says, then after that I'll go to the king, and if I die, I die. But probably the most famous line verse from Esther is this. Um, where is it? 14, the second half of 14. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Usually that's conflated a little bit, and usually you hear, who knows? Perhaps you have come for just such a time as this. And I think that's used oftentimes when people are being called into a higher level of commitment, or some kind of prophetic activity, where the line would come out, who knows? Perhaps this is basically what you were born for. And so that's what he hands over to her to consider. Okay. Anybody have anything? I'm assuming you'll be typing as I'm talking if something comes up that intrigues you or you need some more information on. I don't see anything new here. I'm glad you're all still with me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read some more. And really, as I'm reading, if something comes up, just go ahead and type it in and I'll pick it up after I finish this section. This is at chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace opposite the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you even to the half of my kingdom." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. While they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther said, "This is my petition and request. If I have won the king's favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and then I will do as the king has said." The plot thickens. Haman went out that day happy and in good spirits. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Then he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the ministers of the king. Haman added, "Even Queen Esther let no one but myself come with the king at a banquet that she prepared. Tomorrow also I am invited by her, together with the king. Yet all this does me no good so long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, and then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits." This advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Okay, in this, the only thing that I see here again is the beginning of an echo that will take place over in the Gospels as well. When we have this, um, if it be, you please the king will grant your request up to half of my kingdom. That's exactly what Herod said to Salome, before she, he said, whatever that you want, up to half of my kingdom, I will grant. And she asks for the head of John the Baptist. So, these little courtroom um, court tales have these plot twists, but this will be one that we will hear again. This, that now that you've done something that pleases me as the king, I will give you anything up to half of my kingdom. And then I love this great scene with Haman, who, you probably don't like as we're telling this story, and him just going home and just gloating and talking about how wonderful his life is and all the wonderful things that have been bestowed upon him for whatever reason. It doesn't say why he feels like he deserves them, but he's basically boasting to his friends and his family about how cool things are. But the only thing that bothers him at this point is that Mordecai is there. It just bothers him that Mordecai exists. So his friends say, well, just basically, do away with him in grand manner, and then you can go and enjoy this banquet. So that's where we are as we move into chapter 6. On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of records, the annals, and they were read to the king. It was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold and who had conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So the king's servants told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" Haman said to himself, "Whom the king wishes to honor more than me? Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, with a royal crown on his head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done for the man who the king wishes to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Quickly take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to the Jew Mordecai, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai and led him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his advisers and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." So, do they not know that Esther and Mordecai are related? No, they do not. Not in this, in the Hebrew text, no. In the Greek text, Mordecai seems to be brought into the court, but they don't, they just add things that are different in the Greek text. So it's basically this text with some additional information. So we don't really see how Mordecai got into the court, but he is definitely serving in the court. So I don't even know that people know, they certainly in this story don't have any knowledge of him being related, except for those in the inner court, her servants and the eunuchs who served her, who would go back and forth between Mordecai and her and take messages. So let's just go on and finish this part. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me, that is my petition, and the lives of my people to be destroyed, to the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, whose words saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. So plot thickens, thickens, thickens. But can you imagine? I mean, this is a wonderful drama, the court tale here. The drama, especially that Haman gets his comeuppance, first of all, by having to do what he was describing to the king in hopes that he would get this reward. And then he has to bestow it on his enemy, Mordecai, which would just be awful for him to have to do. Goes home to his house mourning and with his head covered. He's trying to hide himself. And then these friends, these advisors and friends, are the ones who are, it doesn't sound like they're really good friends to him. That basically, you've done it now. You're not going to survive this. You're going to fall before the Jews fall. So then, shortly after that, the eunuchs appear to take him to the banquet. And it's the banquet where the tide turns. And here again, this is, if you remember the story of Nathan and King David, where Nathan, the prophet, is pointing out King David's error in marrying the wife, killing his wife's first husband and taking her as his own. And Nathan tells the story about the man who has just one little ewe lamb who he loves, and then someone comes and takes that one and kills it. And, the king says, "Who is that man? That man shall die." And Nathan says, "You are the man." Drama. I love drama. So similar kind of thing here where, Haman is sitting watching the king and queen come to the aha moment where he is revealed as the bad guy. The uncloaking of the villain happens. And then the very thing that he had planned for his rival or his enemy is what happens to him. So here again, you see the language of hanging, but it's talking about hanging him on the gallows. So it's not hanging him on the gallows, but hanging him on the gallows. So it's, the English is probably not as descriptive of what really is going on. But we picture, I think, when we think about hanging, we think of noose on the neck. And I just think that's not exactly what was going on here. So gallows certainly are the same as we have pictured them. Okay, I'm Phil. What a turn of events! The dastardly dude or the dastardly deed is revealed. I love it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. If you have questions, go ahead and jot them down. On that, and I love how the king has to go out to the garden. He's so angry. It's like, give me a minute. I'm going out to the garden. So he removes himself, but then when he comes back, poor Haman has thrown himself on the couch that just happens to also be occupied by the queen. Probably not a wise move on his part. And now we see that even, it took once Haman had been hanged and kind of foisted on his own petard, as they say, the anger of the king abates. So on that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. So Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Can you imagine what that was like for the house of Haman? Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. Or how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming on my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to the Jew Mordecai, "See, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." The king's secretaries were summoned at that time in the third month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded, to the Jews and to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. He wrote letters in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed them with the king's ring, and sent them by mounted couriers riding on fast steeds bred from the royal herd. By these letters, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, with their children and women, and to plunder their goods on a single day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the writ was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all the peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take revenge on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift royal steeds, hurried out, urged by the king's command. The decree was issued in the citadel of Susa. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, wearing royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a mantle of fine linen and purple. while the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict came, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a festival and a holiday. Further, many of the peoples of the country professed to be Jews because the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Okay, no comments? Let's finish this one out. I got you right here, don't I? Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them, but which had been changed to a day when the Jews would gain power over their foes, the Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who had sought their ruin, and no one could understand them, because the fear of them had fallen upon all the people. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors, the royal officials were supporting the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was powerful in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. So the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, slaughtering and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 people. They killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashti, Arisai, Aridai, Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not touch the plunder. That very day, the number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, "In the citadel of Susa, the Jews have killed 500 people, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled." Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 persons in Susa, but they did not touch the plunder. Now the other Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and gained relief from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested, and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the open towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and fasting, a holiday on which they send gifts of food to one another. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor. So the Jews adopted as custom what they had begun to do, as Mordecai had written to them. Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to crush and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he gave orders in writing that the wicked plot that he had devised against the Jews should come upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore these days are called Purim, from the word pur. Thus, because of all that was written in this letter, and what they faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews established and accepted as a custom for themselves and their descendants and all who joined them, that without fail they would continue to observe these 2 days every year, as it was written, and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every family, province, and city. And these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with the Jew Mordecai, gave full written authority, confirming the second letter about Purim. Letters were sent wishing peace and security to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the king of Ahasuerus, and giving orders that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as the Jew Mordecai and Queen Esther enjoined on the Jews, just as they had laid down for themselves and for their descendants regulations concerning their fasts and their lamentations. The command of Queen Esther fixed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. King Ahasuerus laid tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. All the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was powerful among the Jews and popular with his many kindred, for he sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of all his descendants. The end. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. I believe that the dates are fixed for Purim on February 2nd and 3rd, or it could be that they slide around like Passover and Easter. But it seems to me that it's always at the beginning of February, around in there, that the Jews continue to celebrate this festival, and they read the story of Esther, and they put on costumes, like who's the good guy, and who's, it's like some people dress up like bad people, and then it turns out to be somebody that's a really good person, and so there's this kind of masquerading kind of thing going on. Um, and so they then become part of the story, of somebody who looks to be a bad guy like Mordecai because he's a Jew, and then he turns out to be like the right hand guy of the king. So that kind of switch and that sort of thing. Um, here are a couple of things. There is some indication here in Esther that there might have been a couple of manuscripts that were conflated, that were put together in piece, because they seem to be going along in chronological order, and they talk about this kind of, here's the Jews struck down all their enemies. This is at 9:5. And then they start to enumerate who was killed in the citadel of Susa, and it says the 10 sons of Haman, you know, but they didn't touch the plunder. And then a little bit further down, it's like the conversation between Queen Esther and the king is enumerated, and the king commands that they be killed. So it's kind of like, wait, did that get printed out of order, or what's the deal here? But that kind of stuff, where something that's already been spoken is then told as if the reader doesn't know it, or the audience doesn't know it, is some kind of indication that there might have been some sort of scribal transition, or something in the original document that had been mended, or something along those lines. So that's just a little thing for you to kind of, it's still part of the initial story and the original document, but there might have been something that happened there that took that and made it a little bit out of order. The other thing here is, one of the reasons why Esther was translated and retranslated is that the Hebrew text, which I think it's the authoritative text for Scripture, which is why it's in the Bible, and the Greek text is present, but it's in the Apocrypha, which is not part of the canon. So it was the story that was written in Hebrew that was accepted as the story that the Jews would then carry forward. But it was difficult for them because of the killing, because, well, a couple of things. It was difficult for them because Esther, as a leader, was a woman, and that was um, not the norm. So to have, the heroine or the hero be a heroine was was difficult for people to understand and to accept. The fact that there is very little attribution to the ruling power of the universe, namely God. There is no mention of God. The only place where it even seems to refer is in the conversation between Mordecai and Esther, where he's encouraging her that this may, that this is her destiny. And let me just read. It's the end of chapter 4 at 14. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. What's he referring to? And I think the intention is that if you don't do this, because this is what God has put you here for, God will take care of it in a different way. So that's part of the deal here, where there is this sense of some sort of divine, not intervention, but divine guidance in this, that God is helping make use of what's going to happen here. That there have been people have made decisions which went one way, and then God helped people respond to that thing. It's kind of like how I talk about the pandemic. The pandemic, God didn't cause the pandemic so we'd learn some lessons. But you know what? We've all learned a lot because of this pandemic. So God uses those things that people do. Okay, I got some comments here. Could Haman's edict, not carried out, be similar to Herod's edict to kill all the Jewish baby boys, which was carried out? Yes, thank you. Another echo. And and that kind of thing, it just seemed like that was the only way that people dealt with enemies, is to oh, I hadn't thought about that, but to just eradicate them, or at least the way they thought, to just eradicate them um, by killing the boys. That's what happened with Moses. They were trying to get rid of the Jews, and so they were killing all the babies, the male babies, and Moses' mom puts him in a little basket and shoves him down the Nile, you know. Um, so that seems to be the way to answer how you deal with enemies when you want to get rid of them. There's no just, beat the snot out of them. It's like they must be eradicated. So we see it here with Haman, we see it with Moses, we see it with Herod. And now, it seems like if that's the kind of the mindset of the ancient world, that when you conquer a nation, you have to annihilate them. I mean, I can see where that feeds into Nazi Germany, the eradication. It's not just we want to kill Jews. It's like we want to eradicate the race, and that seems to be part of the Jewish history. So um, I'm surprised really now in thinking about the scholarship I've read about this, that scholars even cringe at what happens at the hands of the Jews. That the same kind of sense of eradicating the enemies um, has that sense of you just have to get all of them, and don't leave anybody alive. The other thing that goes along with that in some of the midrash documents of the rabbi is that um, the Jews, it keeps saying in the story, but they didn't touch the plunder. So this was the eradication of the enemy. This was not a war to conquer or to find gain. This was just getting rid of the vermin. And so that the fact that nobody took the plunder was kind of, they're doing this in an honorable way. I don't quite understand that, but I mean, I think that's part of what one of the rabbis who talked about, how did they make sense of this? Um, the Jews being the ones who are just killing people right and left. And it didn't come from God. But here again, this is one of the difficulties of not having God spoken of. because there are many times where God says, get rid of the Amalekites to King Saul, and Saul gets rid of all the Amalekites except for this one guy, and um, he doesn't succeed in doing that, and then Samuel has to do cleanup, to finish what God has called them to do. So that's part of the problem that people have with the Old Testament, where thousands and thousands of people are killed at God's command, and that's where we get that, the judge and the sword of God and all that sort of thing. So Lloyd says, so this is where the Jews were allowed to go on? Yes. One of the times, we have a number of times where, there is a place where they come right to the brink of extinction, and then are continue to live. So when we talk about I think that's when we talk about the chosen people of God, that there is a providence that has gone ahead of the people of Israel, since Abraham was called, and that's not part of that is I think that's part of the covenant between God and the people of Israel, and I think what we ought to do is just stay out of that. That's our call is just to deal with people, but eradication or cleansing of any kind. Um, God has protected the people of Israel, in these kinds of situations. I'm not saying He's giving them bounty or blessing them beyond all measure. I mean, certainly we have not seen that in history, but there is a place here where they were allowed to continue. So good insight on. Thanks for the questions, you guys. Okay, so oh my, that was just an hour of me talking. Wasn't that exciting? Okay, so unless you have other questions, and if you think of them, you can always just email me or text me and say, "Oh, I had another thought about Esther." I have two other small books that I'd like to have us do, and then we'll go ahead and move into Genesis. But I would like to go do the book of Jonah, and then immediately following the book of Jonah is the book of Micah. And I think those, Micah, especially during this time, has been quoted a lot about what does the Lord require of us. So I think those two books will go nicely together. They don't have anything to do with one another, but maybe, I mean, all the Bible books have a lot to do with one another. We just have to kind of find the connections. So next time, Jonah, which is on 1496 in the Lutheran Study Bible. And we will begin that then on July the 15th, which is the 30th anniversary of my ordination. Woohoo! And I can't think of a better way to spend it than being with you guys in the scripture. That'll be a wonderful celebration. So, okay, so thank you all for being with me today. I will see you next week, or I'll see some of you tomorrow evening for the conversations on racism. And we will move happily along as we go. Have a great day and stay safe, stay healthy. Love you all. Bye-bye. Oh my gosh. Lloyd did a question on the phone. Or maybe Melva did. She said, type this.
Yeah,
Lloyd, type this.
That might be.